Liberty Street. Encounters at Ground Zero. Chapter 9. I Lost My Benchmark. Kevin McCrary used to wonder whether the height of the Twin Towers exceeded the distance from the plaza to his father's apartment in Battery Park City. He was curious to know how he and his father would fare if the twins fell over. He contemplated this and other bad scenarios after the North Tower was bombed in 1993, but he had always pondered the question. There wasn't anything morbid or obsessive about it. Catastrophic speculations arise naturally at the feet of such vertical bodaciousness. We all fear the sky falling in one way or another. Some long for it, under threats of Islamist fascism or homegrown offensives such as we saw in Oklahoma City. One's idle imaginings can feel like preparedness, and hysterical symptoms can start to look like self-preservation. The fact that those buildings couldn't have held together enough to topple down like trees didn't dispel either the image or the anxiety. If the world were to allow for the felling of those giants, to say that they couldn't fall down flat was a quibble that was easily ignored. However they would fall, we now understand it wasn't easy to have predicted where out of reach or safely out of harm's way would be. Look at the dock workers in India concerned about contaminants in the World Trade steel they were offloading from freighters. According to the Basel Convention, a nation is responsible for the safety of its exports, but that didn't affect the scrapped steel from the Trade Center because the United States hasn't cared to sign the Basel Convention. So guys in India worried about their health, and they complained about the pieces of Lower Manhattan coming to get them on the Bronzer, the Shanghai, and the Pindos. If they did not feel safe, shouldn't we allow for restless concerns on Liberty Street? One day in the 1990s, floating the same postulate as Kevin had, Donavin and his older son, Colin, paced off, step by step, the height of the tallest twin, starting at its base and measuring down Maiden Lane the 1,368 feet until they reached their apartment on Pearl Street. "We're right on the border," Donavin told me. "It was close. We might have just made it. We might not have." After September 11, the progress of urban redevelopment accomplished what the Twin Towers did not. It pulverized the building in which Donavin had lived. In fact, it disappeared most of that block, retaining little more than the facade of a warehouse William Colgate had built for toothpaste in 1832. On the 11th, the family apartment with month-old little man in residence saw the trades moving in, not as steel, as ash, as the family moved out. But I like to envision that pace-off with Colin, that midday outing between a father and a son down that old bending street that used to debouch onto Broadway with the best Broadway view of both towers. Charles Dickens, who walked Lower Manhattan and wrote about the perilous nature of life on Wall Street in his book American Notes, could have used such a curious walk to launch a new novel into serial publication in Master Humphrey's Clock and Harper's Weekly. The question as to whether, when they walked thus together under the shadow of the tower, the gentleman and the boy, who could only have been his son, might perchance have been perceived from either rooftop or window to be satisfying more than a mere flush of eccentrical whim with which to entertain the day, will be answered soon enough. Was it folly? Was it paranoia? In a neighborhood coerced into eating those buildings, no one can be faulted for having paced off their measure, especially as the people who put them up were partially bluffing about their safety. It is, at least, taking your curiosity into your own hands and feet. I had done something similar in that same neighborhood when I climbed up the stairs, 50-plus floors to the top of the Woolworth building, where construction guys invited me onto an unprotected balcony to share the view with them. In those days, the twins were a prime part of the view, but that is not why I walked up to the top. I had had a crazy notion about wanting to know more of what the height of the building meant really, in the day when it was built. Could I feel in my legs what they saw in their eyes? Climbing the dome of St. Peter's in Fellini's La Dolce Vita, a woman asks the protagonist, Marcello, how high it is. "Oh, very high," he says. When the climb doesn't ever seem to end, that elemental high means something to the mass of evacuees moving at 1 floor per minute down the World Trade stairwells, of which both buildings were short 1 set. High could have meant you would die that day, as it could have for firefighters moving the other way with up to 100 pounds of gear and commitment to a job in which bad luck can burn you alive. And so here is a question. If a carpenter and his son showed sufficient curiosity to take that rulered walk through the Austin Tobin Plaza, across Broadway, and on down Maiden Lane, and even light-hearted anxiety over the fate of those extraterrestrials, didn't they deserve some measure of prevention from the mightiest force of government on the globe? Donavin and Son, in that singular occupation, measuring off the distance between life and sudden death, while the rest of downtown rushed about its daily business, is one of the many images that prompted me to wonder, as I photographed the site, whether the safety of the American citizenry was ever on the Cheney-Bush agenda. That pace-off was not the only time Donavin turned one of the towers, those potential bone crushers, into a yardstick. For the carpenter in Donavin, the twins were the handiest of instruments for testing the trueness of buildings in Lower Manhattan. Whatever it was to anyone else, the World Trade Center was a straight edge to him, and he could carry it anywhere conveniently. Donavin positioned visually a corner of the building under inspection so that its vertical line was left with only a narrow space between it and a tower. This was, in effect, the introduction of the straight edge. "It's a natural plumb bob," he said. "Perfectly vertical, perfectly plumb, so no matter how you look at it, it's going to show if something else is straight." By lifting his head to one side, Donavin moved the lines of both buildings until they touched and their edges crossed or blended. Then he would separate them slightly. In the light between the two, any imperfection in the vertical line of the building being tested showed itself beside the straight edge of the tower. "As a carpenter, that's how you test your framing work," Donavin said. "To tell when a stud is out, to tell when a doorway's out. You get used to it after a while." Casually, impulsively, Donavin was taking the tallest structures in the city and matching them up against buildings with which they shared a sightline. "It's a disorder," he told me. "I'd have to take a quick glance at the trades just to check on every building." Like an accountant I know who reaches his hand around without looking to do sums on his calculator during a conversation with you, sums that have nothing to do with your taxes or anything else, Donavin would sometimes close one eye when he was talking at a window, and he'd shift his head slowly in structural judgment. I was too late for the trades, but he was using other buildings that had passed the trade test and were trustworthy now to take their place. It served no professional purpose, but it was a professional act, for it flowed from what he did, and it was interesting and instructive to test the work of brother builders from these older generations. Walking the streets around Ground Zero while the flatbeds were carrying off his old straight edge, we would pause now and then to pick up the Chase Manhattan Bank or One Liberty Plaza, and together we would hold it against a building from the 20s or the 30s, or something older, in order to take its measure. The plum police were pleased. "These old buildings are totally perfect," Donavin said. "I've never found a leaner. The trade towers were great for that, though. The biggest straight line there is. They were so easy to find, so tall and perfectly straight that I used them all the time, 10 times a day. Every day I would sight every building as I was walking downtown. That was my favorite thing to do. They were the best straight edge. September 11, I lost my benchmark."